Ezekiel 22, verse 30. I want to lift it again from the Message Bible. Listen to what it says. I looked for someone to stand up for me against all this, to repair the defenses of the city, to take a stand for me and stand in the gap to protect this land so I wouldn't have to destroy it. I couldn't find anyone. Amen. From this scripture tonight, I want to talk about why slavery still matters. Why slavery still matters. One of the most dominant subjects in America, if not the most dominant and controversial subject, is that of racism. It's a hot button topic anywhere you go, and I certainly believe that before our nation can move forward and before there can be any progress in the name of our Lord, we have to effectively dialogue about the subject of racism. It's all around us. We see the saga playing out with Colin Kaepernick from the NFL, the quarterback who is unemployed. The NFL refuses to hire him. He's one of the higher rated quarterbacks in the league. He seemingly has been blackballed from the NFL, as it appears, for taking a knee in the name of justice for those young black men who've been killed by police officers. Took a knee, and other NFL players took a knee during the national anthem, and so the discussion quickly moved from equality and race and justice to that of partisan politics and dealing with corporate interests. Our president, and let me pause and suggest tonight that I will be using flat terms tonight, so I hope I don't offend your sensitivities. Hope you've got more faith than that. But our president called all who took a knee sons of bitches, and he declared that they should be removed from the league and possibly even sent out of our country. We've seen race crop up a lot with the police killings of unarmed black men. I don't dare name one, I'll forget another, but it's been so many over the recent years that it's something that pushes our buttons. We've had two here in our own backyard. We have it is such an issue because at the forefront of the police killings is a movement called Black Lives Matter. And so many of our educated and positive intellectual young adults have migrated to Black Lives Matter in the name of justice, but we find a discrepancy in their public appeal, for they will show up readily for any police shooting, anything relative to black and white, but they are absent and silent for those things which are black on black. We have not heard from them, but when you go to their website, and I ask you to go to their website and study for yourself, you'll understand the difference. Black Lives Matter is not all given to dealing with the issues of race in America, because they state right there on their website that one of the goals of their organization is to transform and revolutionize the civil rights movement away from the black male heterosexual to now the gay and trans homosexual female. So they want to change the face of the civil rights movement from straight black men to gay black women. It's right there on their website. We've seen the issue of race in 2017 with the Charlottesville race riot, where one young woman lost her life. We saw that play out over that weekend. But then, even beyond and before these issues in society, we've all seen and heard dog whistle politics, where even Ronald Reagan played a part, where he used terms like welfare queens and strapping young bucks to refer to blacks that he figured were on welfare or living in poverty. Dog whistle politics helps them use racist terminology without the public being aware that they're being racist. But then, for those who voted for Hillary Clinton to be president, Hillary also played dog whistle politics when her husband was president, because she argued for or against super predators, which was a very laced term describing young black men, super predators. And they've used these African American synonyms and made the actual African American synonymous with welfare, even though more whites use welfare than blacks. It's social programming. But then what about Mr. Trump, our president? He has been a part of dog whistle politics and seemingly flat out racism. Not only did he call both sides in the Charlottesville riot wrong, but in 1989, Trump took out a full-page news ad in New York calling for the death penalty for what was called the Central Park Five. 5 young teenage black men were charged in the assault and rape of a young 28-year-old white woman that left her unconscious and in a coma for 12 days. They went to jail for years, lost their teenage years, and ultimately it was determined that they had nothing to do with the crime. They were falsely imprisoned. And what did Mr. Trump do when New York decided to settle with these young 5 men who lost their childhood for something they didn't do? When they were awarded $41 million, Donald Trump then said it's a disgrace that they were paid, and he says that this is a high crime. It's a heist, is what he called it. So race is all around us, and we have to deal with the subject of race. And I declare that the issues that we see today with relation to race, it all stems back from slavery, because slavery, it still matters, it's still important, and until we reconcile the question of slavery, we will still have these problems. In seminary, 22 years ago at Virginia Union University at Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology, on the first day in Old Testament, our professor, who's about 10 feet tall with a 3-foot afro, Dr. Jerome Ross, he's 6'7", 6'8", afro, very intelligent scholar, great preacher. He talked to us on the first day about the Sitzenleben. Sitzenleben is a German term. When you're doing your biblical studies, it deals with the social setting. In other words, you can't just read the Bible, you have to get into the social setting to find out who they're talking to and what's going on in the text. And so when you get into the social setting of Ezekiel 22, verse 30, our text for tonight, when you get in the background, you understand that we're dealing with people who have been carted away into slavery, not indentured servitude, but slavery. They've been taken from Jerusalem, and they've been taken 1,000 miles approximately into Babylon, and they're made slaves. So this is part of the Babylonian captivity. And in this Babylonian captivity, when you look at our earlier verses, it shows you that the people in this text that God is talking to, they have lost themselves. They are no longer the people that they were. Something about slavery has changed their identity. Something about slavery has caused them to lose themselves. When you read the book of Daniel and Jeremiah, you understand that when slavery became prevalent in the Word of God, we saw changes were made by those who were holding the slaves. In the book of Daniel, they not only carted them out of their home into slavery, but they changed their names, they changed their food, their diet. Of course, they were now dislocated from home, so they had no connection to their source or their home ground, but their family structure changed, even attempted to change their God. How can you stay the same when your God is changed? You're no longer at home. Your family structure has changed. Your language has changed. Your name has changed. Your diet has changed. You are now property of someone else, and you're asked to change and adapt to their ways of life. Slavery in America historically started in 1619 and ended in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. That's 246 years of slavery. The Africans, black folk, were enslaved here in America from 1619 to 1865, 246 years. Using the math that 25 years is what we term a generation, then that means 9.8 generations, nearly 10 generations of black folk endured slavery directly. 10 generations of black folk were humiliated, beaten, tortured, family destroyed, raped, murdered, sold right on American shores. 10 generations of folk. Now, I hope you write some of this down tonight, and I hope you take notes because I'm going somewhere. Today, we are only 154 years removed from slavery. 10 generations of black folk endured slavery, and we are only 6 generations removed from slavery. If 25 years is a generation, as science gives, then we are 6 generations removed from slavery. 10 generations of people from parent to child, parent to child, parent to child, passed down for 10 generations in slavery, and we are only 154 years or 6 generations removed from slavery. Why is all of that important? I want you to write down this word called epigenetics. Epigenetics, EPI genetics, epigenetics. Epigenetics is basically it is the study of gene transformation through life experience. DNA is basically inflexible, but science has proved that DNA can be altered by one's life experience. For example, in epigenetics, they did a study on mice. They exposed mice to a fragrance called acetophenone for 25 days. They exposed these mice to acetophenone, this fragrance. They would expose them to the fragrance, and at the same time the mice were exposed to this fragrance, they were at the same time shocked with a mild shock to their feet. So when the fragrance would hit the atmosphere, their feet would be shocked for 25 days. The mice were exposed to acetophenone, this fragrance. They would smell it every day and be shocked every day. When the smell would come, they would be shocked. When acetophenone hit the atmosphere, they would be shocked 25 days. Well, after 25 days, these mice were allowed to mate, and they discovered something amazing. After 25 days of being exposed to acetophenone and shocking the mice, when they reproduced, they called this group F1, the offspring of these mice that had been tested with the fragrance and the shock at the same time. When they produced offspring, they separated them and called this group F1. Something strange happened. When they exposed F1, the offspring, to the fragrance, the mice had an adverse effect. They had not any known actual experience with the fragrance, but something genetically happened to where now the actual aversion to this smell was passed genetically down to them. The study kept on going. They discovered that when F1 gave birth, they called this group F2. And when they exposed F2 to the fragrance, F2 had the same response to acetophenone. Do you see what I'm saying? Genetically, the life experience of the parent was passed down genetically to the offspring. After only 25 days, there was genetic alteration. It was a transformation of genes after only 25 days, and it became a physical and psychological reality to generations who were not even tested. The children and grandchildren reacted the same way to what mama and daddy reacted to, with no known physical contact. It was passed down genetically. And so science concluded that life experience can influence the expression of otherwise inflexible DNA codes. 25 days. 25 days. 25 days. Black America was enslaved for 246 years. 10 generations. There was only one generation exposed to 25 days, and it impacted genetically 2 generations removed from it. Black America has been suffered slavery for 246 years, 10 generations. And the fact of the matter is, when we look around and see the black predicament in America, we are looking at gene alteration. It's easy to critique black America and say what we're not doing. The hard part is identifying where it came from. No one wants to talk about slavery. But we have to talk about slavery because we are still under the influence. Let's talk about generational curse, if you will. What is a generational curse? Is this not what a generational curse is? We say a generational curse is basically when the negative in a life is passed down from one generation to the next. When a parent sees in the child the same life choices, the same outcome or results that they experienced, and then it's passed down to the grandchildren. The children's children are now falling into the same traps. And so the addiction of one generation is passed down to another generation. The poverty of one generation is passed down to the next generation. We are seeing what we call a generational curse played out before us. Something genetically in us through our life experiences has altered not only us, but our children, our children's children. 246 years of slavery, and America thinks we should be all right. There was no global counseling for black America. There was no therapy. There was no reparations. We were just set free. 10 generations of being beaten and abused, having the structure of our family torn apart, being called property and not human, being treated less than and never equal. And we wonder why we are the way that we are. And this is not only for black America, but isn't it the same for white America? Has not white America been trained to look at black America the same way? Because don't forget, white America genetically has been predisposed to look at black America a certain way. And so we're seeing the race question played out on both sides of the coin because We've been enslaved, and there was nothing given as a way to reconcile 246 years. I just want to deal with three areas that I see in Black America tonight that I believe are the most upfront to us. There are many areas that were problems or became problems from slavery. These were the issues in slavery, what it did to Black America. But I just want to, there's a lot more, but I only want to deal with three tonight, and then I will give us a resolve. The first thing is this. Write this down. Slavery inhibited family formation. Slavery inhibited family formation. When we look out today, write this down. What are we seeing as it relates to the black household? 77% of black births are to single mothers. 77% of black births are to single mothers. And that's the latest report as of today from the Washington Examiner. 77% of black births are to single parents. So over 3/4 of our children have no concept of what it means to have a father in the home. Over 3/4 of our children are born to single mothers, and they have no concept of what it means to have a father in the home. When I taught school in Baltimore at the Pimlico Middle School, immediately I became aware of something amazing. I could tell a young black child in 6th grade that I was having discipline problems with. I could tell him to sit down, and he wouldn't listen. If I said sit down, he remained standing. I said shut up, he kept on talking. Whatever I said, he did the opposite because I had no value to him. But a black teacher could walk by the room, step in and put her hands on her hips, and he'd sit right down and act like he's doing some work. Because he had more respect for a black woman because that's his rearing. No respect for the black man who has been absent. So today we see 3/4 of our black children who don't know what it is to have a father in the home. When a father is in the house, a father brings several things to the household. Let's look at these very quickly. Father brings several things to the household. Number one, a father brings a work ethic. Father's role in the house is to demonstrate and command a work ethic out of his children. Teach his children how to work, not to be lazy, not how to scam, but how to work. That's the type of household that I grew up in. My father trained us to work. I love my children, their attitudes when it gets down to the last days of school. They're so excited. They just get overjoyed, and when the last day comes, they want to sleep late. They want to lay around, play games, go to the video game place or Sky Zone, just have fun day after day. But in the household that I grew up in, at the age of 10, when summer was over, I went to work for Joe Keaton. And so Joe Keaton, in houses that he had purchased, he was an electrician and contractor, and so he taught me how to put in receptacles and light switches and hang lights. And so here is a 10-year-old boy working on your house. Got my little tool pouch on, I'm putting the light switches in, the lights, hanging lights. I'm in attics, walking through attics. I'm under houses out in the country with snakes under the house, and I'm scared to go under the house. But Daddy said, boy, somebody got to do it. Get under that house and run that wire. And I'm under the house, 10 years old, with snakes and mice or whatever, running wire through these houses because I worked for Joe Keaton. And then there were days when I didn't have to go to work to go under houses or go into attics, but I had to chop wood. And so Daddy had me, he says, here, he walk outside. We live on this hill with a bunch of trees. He says, listen, we need wood for winter. That tree, this tree, and that tree, I want you to cut them down, and then I want you to take the wood and stack it down there. And so you see a 10-year-old boy filling up a chainsaw. Who lets a 10-year-old boy operate a chainsaw unsupervised? And I'm out there pulling that chain, and I'm chopping down a tree, and then I get the maul, the heavier version of an axe, and then I'm chopping the tree up, and then I get a wheelbarrow, and I carry the wood all the way around the house, down through the yard, out in the woods, and I neatly stack it. And then when I wasn't doing that, I had to work the garden, because Joe Keaton had a garden, and he believed in having virtually everything in his garden, and I had to work the garden. Then on other days, he would come in with a big case of oil, and he would say, I tell you what I want you to do today. I want you to go change the oil in your mama's car and change the oil in this truck. Lunchtime, I'm coming back home. I'm going to bring another truck to pick this truck up, and then you change the oil in that truck, and your brother's going to come 2 hours after that, and he's going to bring another truck, and I want you to change the oil in that truck. And so now, here I am, age of 10, 11, with this oil in the bottom garage, in the keys, got the keys in my mama's car, back her car up out of the top garage. I go down to the bottom garage. I'm jacking it up. Who lets a 10-year-old boy up under a car unsupervised to change the oil? I had a work ethic. Joe Keaton had a work ethic. We were all raised to do work. And so our summers were not lazy. They were taught to work. A father also brings protection. He protects the house. He protects the property, protects the people in the house. That's the role of a father, protection. A few days ago, I wasn't home. You know, now the kids, at first they didn't like to stay home by themselves, but now they're getting to the point where they do stay home. But Joseph got to the point where he thought he heard something while he was home by himself. I had left maybe 20 minutes earlier. Then Kim came in. So Joseph says, Mommy, I think I heard somebody or something upstairs. So she says, okay, let's go up and see. So he says, wait a minute. And he goes running and comes back and runs and gets in front of her. He says, let me go first. He says, I got you protected. And guess what he had? A sharpened pencil. That was his weapon. He got what he could get. A sharpened pencil. And he walked ahead of Kim up the steps to go check out what was there. Father also brings discipline to the household, correction, so that actions become the best that one can be. And finally, a father brings an attitude of servantry unto God. He teaches in the household to worship God. We have children today who have no concept of a father in the house. 77% of our young black children have no idea what it is to have a father in the house. And so we wonder what the problem is at school when they won't sit and listen. We wonder what the problem is when they're out in the street getting in trouble, because they have no concept of what God intended to be in the house. Slavery inhibited family formation. During slavery, families were separated by way of sale. When slaves were sold on the selling block, a husband or a father would be sold to one owner, and he would be on one plantation. His wife and mother of children could be on another plantation with the children, or she could be on a separate plantation sold to another white owner and the children sold to another plantation. Can you imagine that? Families broken up at the selling block. See, we're arguing, rightly so, about the detention center and the separation of families at the border, where Trump wants to build his mythical wall. But this ain't the first time children have been separated. In slavery from 1619 to 1865, black families were separated at the selling block. Fathers would be on one plantation, mother would be on another one, and the children would be on another. And the owner owned the children, not the wife, not the husband, not the father, not the mother. They were now property of the owner. They couldn't even marry legally in slavery because marriage was prohibited. It wasn't even recognized by law. We wonder why in the black household that is so disjointed. The Million Man March years ago was about putting the black man back in the family and bringing the family back together. But what has caused the break in the family? Slavery inhibited family formation. Now this is where it's going to get even tough, so brace your sensibilities. On the plantations, they had what they called sex farms on the plantation. And on the sex farms, a number of things took place, but one thing that took place was called buck breaking. Buck breaking. This is where the plantation owner took a strapping Negro slave, a defiant slave, a big surly slave, and he would call together all the slaves, and he would call his friends on other plantations, and they would come to this buck breaking ceremony. And in front of a slave congregation, all the slaves from the plantation, they would see the biggest among them beaten. And not just beaten bloody, but beaten into submission. Beaten so bad they couldn't stand, crying out in pain. Body wretched in pain. But that wasn't the end of it. That plantation owner would then cut down a tree and leave the stump high enough. And that slave, this big burly slave that everyone looked to with respect and fear and adoration, they would now see this slave have his pants pulled down, have him bent over the stump, and then the owner would commence to sodomizing him in front of the whole congregation of slaves. But not only him, the other slave owners that he invited over would all take their pants down and have a turn. So they beat the biggest slave into bloody submission and then sodomized him in front of his children, his wife, and all the slaves, because the lesson was this psychologically: he can't protect you. You don't look to him. You look to the strongest, and the strongest is the one who caused this. Now, here is another one. And I thought about this, and I really, since we got children, I won't say it. I was going to say it if there were no children here. But the mother F word. Okay? Have you ever wondered where that came from, mother F? And that was a word I used to keep in my back pocket. That was a back pocket word. It rolled real good off my tongue. It flowed quite freely, very rhythmically. But where did it come from? It came from slavery. Historically, it is said that the white slave masters would rape slave mothers to further break down the black family and causing physical and psychological trauma. But the child that was born from this rape could never call him father, could never call him dad or daddy. He could only refer to him as Mother F. That's where it came from. Let's move on. Number 2, write this down. Number 1, slavery inhibited family formation. Number 2, slavery prohibited education. I want you to write that down. Slavery prohibited education. Slaves were not allowed to go to school. Slaves were not allowed to read, to study, or to write. The only book that the slave could learn halfway is the Bible. And this is why Christianity has gotten such a bad name by Muslims today. The Nation of Islam, they call it the white man's religion. It's because the only scriptures that the slave could learn and all that they heard was obey your master. For this is what the Lord has commanded. They would read that from the book, and they would even educate only one black preacher in the Bible, and he would read and preach to other slaves, obey your master. And so Christianity has gotten a bad rap because this is what slaves were taught. So blacks have evolved to the point of saying that this is, quote unquote, the white man's religion. Interestingly enough, during Hurricane Katrina, FEMA hired black preachers to preach to the people inside that big Coliseum. And what did they tell them to do? Preach about obedience to those in authority over you. Because don't forget, they had soldiers with guns. And so the black preachers were hired, paid, to now preach to these people who've been displaced by a storm, or bombs went off as stated by witnesses, flooded their homes and took it all over. They were told to now preach obedience so these people in the Coliseum wouldn't be rowdy, wouldn't cause a riot or make a fuss, but they would be obedient to those who have authority over them. Slaves couldn't read. In today, the National Assessment of the Educational Process says this, write this down. For Black America, only 18% of fourth graders read proficiently. Only 18%. Only 19% can do math proficiently. Fourth grade blacks, 18% read proficiently, 19% do math proficiently. Only 42% of Black America actually graduate college. Dismal numbers. 18% in fourth grade read proficiently, 19% do math proficiently, 42% of Black America are college graduates. Dismal numbers. And we wonder, where did it come from? Slavery prohibited education. There was a law passed in South Carolina in 1740 and adopted in Virginia in 1819, which gave out corporeal punishment up to 20 lashes if a slave was found reading or studying any material. And any owner who condoned it was fined $100. In today's money, that's over $3,000 for any slave that was found reading. They did not want slaves to read, to study, to write, to have no educational background, no educational knowledge. And so when we go forward and see the dismal educational numbers today in Black America, we wonder where it came from. Peter Drucker, great public speaker, in one of his writings, he said that the African American or Black America is the least likely to be educated. And so as he's talking about the new economy, it really doesn't include us because we're the least likely to be educated. Let's move on to the third and final one. So we see, number 1, slavery inhibited family formation. Slavery, number 2, prohibited education. And then slavery, number 3, made Africans property of white masters. Did you not know that slaves could not own anything whatsoever? Nothing. Even the clothes on their back, they did not have a right to them. They were always made to understand that they could not own anything, and they themselves were property of the white master. That they themselves were not considered human, but they're simply property to be done with as the master pleases. The slave couldn't own anything. And so we wonder why black America doesn't have much ownership. We don't have much ownership because we don't have a mind to own. And we don't have a mind to own because for 10 generations, our people were made to believe that we couldn't own anything. Isn't that amazing? Write this down, 242. The average black person in America is 242 years behind the wealth of the average white person in America. Every time a white child is born, statistically, science says that they come into this world 242 years ahead of us in wealth. Black children are born, when they come into this world, they are immediately 242 years behind their white counterpart financially. For years we were taught to not own, that we couldn't own, that we were not able to own, that we were simply property. And so we wonder why these have happened. 246 years of no family structure, 246 years of being controlled, 246 years of not being educated, 246 years of being told that you're less than human, 246 years of being beaten and raped, 246 years of being humiliated, sold, and murdered, all legally right here in America, passed down from parent to child, 10 generations of this, and we are only 6 generations removed from slavery. Only 6. So we are still under the effects of slavery. Don't forget, in epigenetics, only 25 days change the genetic structure. So if 25 days can do this to mice, then what happens after 246 years to any male or female? Doesn't have to be black. 246 years of anything to any group of people, and there's gonna be historically lasting effects felt by generations on end. Look at the Bible. The generation that started out of Egypt, they could have made it from Egypt to the promised land in 11 days, but it took 40 years, and the people that got in were not the people that left. Because there were some things genetically that God had to get out of the bloodstream that he didn't want in the promised land. Don't forget, the whole time they were in the wilderness, what did they do? They argued, fussed, and fight, and they said, we were better off back in Egypt. At least we could have died and been buried. We didn't have to worship in no school. We had a church. We could have been buried. We could have had a wonderful burial. We had everything back in slavery. They argued and fussed the whole time, but God waited until all of that generation died out. And only 2 people from that day got in because there was something passed down that God did not want in the promised land. Look in the text, our text for tonight. Look what God is saying. He says, I'm looking for someone who'll take a stand against this. And against this, when you go back to the earlier verses again, we see where the priest has colluded with politicians. You read the scripture, there is collusion between the priesthood and politicians. They're now working together. And so the politicians have given the priest power in society if they will now convince the people that God has said something that God never said. And so all the while that this political and religious corruption is going on in the land, people are dying, robbing is happening, crimes are being committed, violence is happening, people are starving, right down in slavery. Slavery has caused the people to change their mind, to take up an identity that God never gave them. Something about slavery convinced them to change. And so God says, I need somebody, I've been looking for somebody, anybody to stand up to this loss of identity in the land. And he says, I couldn't find anyone. So God has seen the effects of slavery, and he says, I need to find someone to stand up against the effects of what I see in my people. So what's needed today? Write this down. What's needed today is genetic transformation by a new set of life experiences to rewrite the individual hard drive. Genetic transformation by a new set of life experiences to rewrite the hard drive. That's what's needed. Genetic transformation by a new set of life experiences to rewrite the individual hard drive. Here's the point I want to make tonight. One thing that we need to do, one thing and one thing only. If we get this right, I believe everything else will take care of itself, that God knows what he's doing and God's work will be done. Don't have to do 3, don't have to do 5 or 10. One thing that we have to do tonight, write this down. This is what you have to know tonight. All moves cannot be determined by the response I need to see. I'll explain. All moves cannot be determined by the response I need to see. Do you know how easy it is to get frustrated with a lack of response? You know how easy it is to get fed up when you do something and the response is minimal or absent? It'll cause you to say, I'm done, I'm through, I'm quitting this. Because we have an idea in our system for immediate gratification. We need an immediate response. And so if the response is overwhelming, we'll continue. If the response is minimal, I'm done with this. Not doing it anymore. We've all been guilty of it. But look at Jesus. Notice something. He died before his response could be seen. Don't forget, he's the first fruit of the resurrection. He died that we all might have the right to what? The tree of life, that we would live eternally. He had to die before the response could be seen. So here is the thing. As we are here today, what's going to change in black America, in white America? What's going to change the race relations when each of us can work for God in such a way that we don't need to be governed by the responses that immediately gratify us? So in other words, I need to do my part all of my life, knowing that possibly and more particularly it will happen after I'm dead and gone. Change will come. See, I've got to do all I can, do all the right that I know to do all I can, do my part my whole life, and know that my part was good enough for God to use. In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul says, one plants, another waters, but God gives the increase. One plants, one waters, but God gives the increase. There's a long time between what goes in the ground, the seed that's planted in the ground, to the increase that God gives. You can have a conversation with someone and think it's meaningless, but that seed that's being planted. Keep planting your seed. In whatever you do, keep planting your seed, because how many of us in here can testify that someone who didn't have a major influential position in America, someone that many people don't even know about, they became the greatest influence on my life? May have been a bus driver, that became your friend, that knew how to talk to you, someone you can confide in. That person planted seed, and that seed has taken root. Do all that you know to do. Do your part your whole life, and know that your part is good enough for God to use. He will give the increase. Race relations could have been talked about in 2009 with President Obama and his beer summit with Dr. Henry Louis Gates, a professor at Harvard, who was going into his own house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when his neighbors called the police and said somebody's breaking into the house. And when Sergeant Crowley came and arrested the man, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., for trying to get into his own house, the President of the United States called Dr. Henry Louis Gates and called Sergeant James Crowley to the White House for what is now called the Beer Summit. It was a photo op, but there was no meaningful discussion on race. We could have had a discussion then. Trump is giving us great opportunity for discussion with all that his administration is involved in concerning race, not just for black people in white America, but for those who cross the borders. He said he didn't want people from those S-hole countries, meaning Africa. He wanted people from Sweden to come to America. He's given us so much opportunity. But listen, change will not come because of what the president says or does in the White House. Change will come when at a grassroots level, every person under the sound of my voice and every person under the sound of your voice knows, keep planting seed. We're just 6 generations removed. 246 years of slavery. We don't know how many years it's going to keep playing out before it gets out of our system. If you've ever had a blood transfusion, you know it takes a while for them to push all the bad stuff in your blood out of your system. We're just 6 generations removed from slavery. All the bad stuff hasn't been pushed out of our system, but how is it going to happen when average, everyday people keep planting seed in people's lives? Teach your children to plant seed. Seed is the positive. Seed is all God wants you to be. Plant that seed that God has more for you, that you're better than this, that you can go to school, you can be educated, you can rise up and you can be great, you can be number one, you can lead others, you don't have to be a follower. You can plant the seed of leadership, plant the seed of increase, plant the seed of knowledge and education. If you plant the seed generationally, it will take root and it will produce change. The hardest thing that we will have to do, I believe, is do good and knowing I'll die before I'll see the fruit of what I planted, because we want to see it now. Slavery still matters, and we have to have this discussion.